How does change happen? Whether it's in public opinion, legislation, our behaviour, our communities, or just one person's life. At the Change Network, that is our question. A rich and thought-provoking conversation took place at our Digital Change Network event on the 22nd of April 2020. We explored the drop in the number of children and young people in custody in England and Wales. Since 2010, arrests, custodial sentences, cautions and reoffending rates have all dropped. Yet, black and ethnic minority young people are still overrepresented in the system. We heard from 6 experts in the youth justice space. Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice. John Drew, former Chief Executive of the Youth Justice Board. Josh Killenbecker, from Leaders Unlocked. Jhanzab Khan, also from Leaders Unlocked. Whitney Isles, Chief Executive of Project 507. And Jennifer Twite, Head of Strategic Litigation at Just for Kids Law. First up, we asked what has led to the significant drop in the number of children and young people in the criminal justice system so far. First, we heard from Penelope, who ran the Out of Trouble campaign at the Prison Reform Trust.
I think that the most significant change has been a drastic reduction in the number of children in prison. But also there's been a big reduction in the number of children prosecuted over the last 10 years. And I think the change is really interesting because it was pretty gradual, steady over those years, but also it was quite under the radar, really. Even now, a lot of people don't know it happened. I think what was key to it was that there wasn't much change in legislation, but it was a change in practice by people on the ground, by magistrates, and that it was a change that was kind of never in any written policy exactly, certainly from central government, but it was allowed or facilitated, or in some areas it was encouraged.
John Drew, formerly at the Youth Justice Board, reflected on 3 reasons for the change.
Achieving this change was a very complex matter, and there's not really the time here to go into all the detail on this, but 3 things it seemed to me on a national level mattered more than any others. First, we had to reduce the criminogenic impact of the youth justice system. That is, the tendency for contact with the youth justice system to actually cause more crime rather than to reduce it. And we did this by responding differently to children at first signs of trouble, diverting them away from the criminal justice system. The second principal feature of driving this change at a national level was through our realization that we needed to build the effectiveness and credibility of yachts in their work in each court, so that magistrates and judges would feel they had alternatives to custodial sentences in whose use they felt confident. We developed a really strong national partnership with the Magistrates Association around this. Again, it was about shared vision, shared priorities, shared policies. And then the third and last point that I want to talk about this morning was that we encouraged everyone to talk about how important reducing levels of custody was, and to think about how they could contribute to this. I have to say, at first, the government was really anxious about us doing this, but we felt it was sufficiently important to do it anyway. By speaking out, I think we encouraged others to speak about their own beliefs in decarceration, in all the very many different roles and positions that they occupied. And in this way, we built an alliance of, well, I would say 30,000 people around the idea that prison was not a sensible or effective place for children to be. Again, something about shared vision and shared priorities.
Jen told us about her experience of representing children in court and how attitudes have shifted.
So I started out as a pupil barrister in about April 2007, and I was representing a lot of children in the youth court then. And I think that's roughly when we saw the biggest numbers of children in custody. And it was quite shocking, the sort of things that children would be arrested and charged for, which, although we still see some bad examples today, most of the time you would see them now getting out of court disposals or not even being arrested for. So just to give some examples, I remember representing an 11-year-old at court, who'd written the word dog with a pen on the back seat of a bus. And there he was, brought before the youth court for criminal damage. Another example was a boy of a similar age who'd kicked a football at his teacher in the school playground and hit her in the face. And he was charged with assault and again brought before court, full-on prosecution. And the other thing I think that I found really shocking coming into the system was the attitude towards the representation of these children. So I was told that I would be allowed to represent children as a pupil, very junior, charged with very serious offences, that no one would let me near if it was adults charged with the same offences. Because they were tried in the youth court, it paid less, it was less prestigious. I was, as a very junior person who didn't really know what I was doing, let loose on quite serious matters. Around the same sort of time, around 2006, Just for Kids Law was founded. And I think that was very much because the two women who founded it were shocked by how children were treated in the criminal justice system. One of the things that we did was really to push for the representation of children to be seen as a specialism. And one of the things that we have been doing for a long time now is training lawyers. And that's not just about making lawyers better at representing children, although of course that's also quite important, but also about creating a community of lawyers who represent children, who see children as children, who push for their rights, who start making child-friendly arguments in court.
Josh told us his view on how to reduce young people's involvement in the criminal justice system, highlighting how important community organisations were to him.
What I think worked was there was more of a welfare approach. So there was like a multi-agency approach where health, CAMS, what else, and other organisations and professionals joining in to help the young person. And I feel like from personal experience, I feel like a lot of community organisations really helped the young person. And what I think has changed is more young people being able to open up and build relationships with yacht workers and social workers.
Next up, Whitney reminded us to question who exactly has benefited from these changes and why this trend has not benefited Black and minority ethnic children to the same extent as white children.
How did we do so well in one area and then not as well in another area? What are the learnings for us? What do we need to take forward? Was that about kind of representation on who was doing the work in regards of, who was working in the organizations, the charity sector at the time, who was in the criminal justice system at the time, and it just being something that, just wasn't looked at for many reasons? And how do we prevent that from happening moving forward? Because 750 children or whatever the numbers are now, it's still too many children in prison. We still need to be working to lower those numbers and work with those children, because essentially what we're looking at now is those children that are in prison tend to be the ones that, have done more serious things. And now we need to kind of really understand that specialism and doing that work, because essentially we're looking at children that have really been let down by society. And if we're looking at almost 50%, maybe over 50% of those children being from BAME communities, and mostly Black, Brown and Traveller, Roma, Gypsy communities, what has society been doing in order to kind of let them down? So I think we need to keep diversity and disproportionality in the center of the conversation, because it's still such a huge subject.
Josh talked us through some of the implications of disproportionality, particularly on the mental health of Black young men.
I feel like there's been a really high stereotype against the BME community, with being called gang members, and a lot of perceptions in the media, which doesn't really help the young people. The young people look at this and they instantly think, oh, let me live up to that expectation or to that perception of what I'm being called. And it creates a self-hate and mental health increasing in young people, with not very fair sentencing as to others.
Much campaigning work around prison is done under the radar, directly with police and magistrates, rather than through public campaigning or community organising. So how sustainable is it in the long term? Do we need to involve the public to achieve major reforms to the criminal justice system? Penelope Gibbs.
what you have to kind of understand about the criminal justice sector is the budget that is available for policy work and campaigning compared to almost any other sector is minuscule. The cost of that is that A, nobody knows about it, what's happened, and B, I think that we then didn't do the legwork for the sector of trying to change public attitudes. So we have a very unhelpful public debate, which it turns into a political debate about soft and hard justice. We know we have not won that battle. And I suppose looking back, I would say, there was an element of selfishness. We thought we could do this bit under the radar, so we did. But the bigger task of changing attitudes to people who commit crime has absolutely not been done.
John Drew.
If I find any point of, it's not disagreement, but point of emphasis, I would say we probably, and Penelope was one of these people, probably did more in terms of changing people's minds in the period from 2008, 2009 than perhaps could be given the impression. And yes, it's a niche group of people. I talked earlier about 30,000 people working in the youth justice system and around the youth justice system. It's not everyone, I accept that. But actually winning a consensus that this was a desirable activity, that we all had a part to play in it, and that, almost as you got out of bed each morning, you asked yourself, what can I do today to reduce the number of children in custody?
Penelope again.
The sign and symbol of why we need to still change attitudes is that we have the same age of criminal responsibility, 10, that we've had for years and years. We all find that totally unacceptable, but that's the kind of thing I just don't think we have got a cat's hope in hell of changing unless we change the public debate.
Next up is Jennifer on her experiences, both positive and negative, of public campaigning.
Like if you look at the way the press deal with child murderers or any sort of serious offences, they vilify children more than they would, or they do adults for similar offences. So it's almost worse for children. And I think that, as Penelope's right, that we're not going to get anything changed on the age of criminal responsibility, but also changes that we have already made could easily go backwards. And we talk about the numbers of children through reduction being under the radar. I don't think it's widely known. It would scare me for it to be more widely known without that sort of attitude change, because I think you get a lot of negative press. It's quite complex and quite easy to get wrong. You're right, the Let Us Land campaign was one where we were, I think, really successful. We got positive articles even in the Daily Mail, and this was a case about migrants' rights. So, wouldn't necessarily expect that sort of positive press, but I do think that's because we had a very competent press officer who was working very hard on looking at framing, on how, where are these attitudes aligned with the Daily Mail, how could they write a positive story, and building up those relationships. And that takes a lot of work and it's quite difficult. But also we've got it really wrong, even with comms officers. I mean, there have been a lot of cases where I feel that, or I've had hate mail for articles I've written, but I think in some ways worse than that, is that I think some of the stuff we've done has almost taken things back, has actually been bad for our campaigns. So, even with, I would like to say, some experience, I don't think that some of these arguments that we make about individual issues rather than the broader sort of thing about youth justice, like whether we're talking about the Let Us Land campaign or Still a Child at 17 campaign, or all the sort of individual campaigns we run, they're very difficult to get, I think, sometimes get it right and get the sort of nuance right in the press. And I think what we need is a broader, as Penelope says, a broader public debate and hopefully attitudinal change towards it. I don't know how you do that.
Josh discussed the importance of public campaigns to address structural racism and the language we use.
There needs to be more of a youth voice. There needs to be a platform for young people to actually get their voices heard, and more public campaigns to address structural racism and actually challenge the people at the top and the people in power. More campaigns need to be addressed for these young people to have a platform where they can get their voices heard, and for them to actually address all these issues, and children seen as children and not as labelled terms as gang member and so on and so forth. I was reading, I saw an article on the Independent about Akala going on the Piers Morgan Good Morning Britain show, and he was saying that knife crime is seen as a black problem, but it's not a black problem. It's a national public health issue, which is addressed for all the youth in the UK, and it's seen as not a private trouble but a public issue. So it's everyone's problem, and the term used, knife crime instead of serious youth violence, which is great. Is they've changed it to serious youth violence. Is really good for the young people to be recognised as something else.
Whitney told us that it is a privilege to stay under the radar.
Is there a particular type of privilege, or is there privilege being able to go under the radar? Because I think of so many people that when we just walk into the space, we are seen, we are heard, and we kind of represent truth to power in a sense. So that kind of privilege to go under the radar is taken away from us, and maybe those who are able to be a lot louder have less to lose as well, because if we're used to not having the money, you can't really take it away from us in the first instance, or we're used to not working with it anyway. So it's bringing up a load of questions for me, and things to reflect on. And like Joshua said, young black men tend to be seen or portrayed through media. And actually, I've sat in a load of police meetings where it's different terminology used. It's gang members, it's thugs, young brown men that, and especially if they're brown and Muslim or black and Muslim, it's a whole kind of different lens and a different level of risk that is going to be monitored. And there is a lot to reflect on, do we need to be louder in certain circumstances, but also what is the ripple effect for kind of being loud in our speaking truth to power.
To wrap up the panel discussion, we asked each speaker to share their closing reflections on what this example of social change tells us about effective campaigning and what they would like others to take forward. John talked about the power of a broad national issue.
The other thing I'm a really big believer in, and this is not particularly fashionable these days, but is in big government. In other words, that if there is a national issue, it needs to be gripped nationally. And actually, I understand all the arguments about devolution and some of the many benefits of devolution, but there are certain issues that are so important that they need to be gripped by central bodies. And this change, undoubtedly, one part of the change was because it was gripped centrally. We need to keep objectives simple. We need to not to avoid cluttering them with too many other objectives and targets, and keep a very close eye on intersectionality for all the reasons that Whitney in particular has highlighted.
Penelope's takeaway for successful campaigning was to have a clear collective vision without mandating how it should be achieved.
The main thing was that it had a focus, very clear focus, on reducing the numbers of children in prison. It didn't mandate how that was achieved. And that focus gave it a real energy and a flexibility to say, well, we could do it in lots of different ways, and we can do it in a way which isn't the normal way, which is what we did, which was we did a lot of local work with practitioners, and we did some work about legislation, but not that much. So it's that focus on a single aim.
Whitney told us it is important to constantly analyse as you go to learn and improve.
For me, it's about continually to develop the skills to critically analyse as we're doing, rather than reflecting afterwards. I think if we can get, in all of our campaigning and all the work that we do, if we are able to kind of really reflect as we're going and critically analyze the work that we're doing and ourselves within that work. So we, you know, are monitoring intersectionality, monitoring who we're working for, who we might be leaving out. And intersectionality is such a complex topic within itself, because we need to be looking at, you know, class, race, gender, you know, neurodiversity. You know, there's so many different things to it. But it's something that needs to stay continually in the forefront of our mind. And a lot of also what we're talking about is structural violence, and really understanding structural violence, you know, oppression, poverty, racism. These are all things that are playing out structurally, and it's part of the conversation when we speak about kind of young people who are using weapons and how they're being treated. That's all structural violence.
Jennifer told us that planning a cultural shift is messy and hard to attribute.
For me, this really was a cultural change, and a cultural change very much within the sector, so within police and people work, not necessarily within the public, as we've discussed. And that was getting people to see children as children, not just as offenders or gang members. I mean, it's easy in hindsight to look back and go, oh, look how far we've come. And I know there were people working towards it, and were very effective, as we now know. But I think planning that sort of cultural shift that's taken, 10 years, is very complicated.
Joshua hopes the government learns from Glasgow to tackle serious youth violence and invest in trauma-informed, holistic services.
Yeah, I am really worried about knife crime, because knife crime is still on the rise. And I think the government and youth justice need to really look at what is really working and what measures they should put in place, such as what did Glasgow do? How did Glasgow challenge and help tackle knife crime and serious youth violence? And I really think for young people, it's a really scary time, because a lot of young people there's a really high mental health issues and trauma within young people. And those are the most focused young people that are in custody and children in care. There just really needs to be a holistic approach for these young people. And there's a lot of vulnerable young people out there carrying knives and scared for their lives. And we really need to look at what the problem is and what is actually working. There needs to be investments in community organizations and peer mentoring.
Finally, we were lucky enough to hear Caged Revolution, a poem written and read by Jhanzab Khan.
One day, a boy was taken from his home at the age of 6 and thrown into a cave. He saw 3 men walking towards him as he played in his front yard. At first, not thinking the worst, but then he remembered the words of his friend who had said to him just the other day, if you see 3 men, dressed in grey suits and wearing black shades, each of them holding a briefcase in their right hand that hides behind a black leather glove, then know that your time has come. Reports have surfaced that these men are on a scene when kids go missing, families are left searching for daughters and brothers, now their whereabouts are unknown, and the world still wonders. So please, be cautious. Remain under the sunlight and never go out walking into the dark. He stood still, remembering what his friend had said as if he were listening to him speak again. But before he knew it, this kid couldn't move his arms. He was in the back of a black van with his hands tied, eyes blindfolded. His parents still hadn't noticed where he had gone. Little did his neighborhood know he was taken to the peak of a mountain covered in snow. The weather conditions, a man who murdered many. It would be foolish to think that this kid would survive. The journey was deadly. When he finally arrived to the very top of the mountain, the kidnappers got out of the van and left the boy tied up in the back. They walked towards the entrance of a nearby cave, lifted the heavy rock that covered the front of it, took him out of the van, and threw him inside. In this cave, the boy was left alone. The exit was concealed. With no escape, he shivered in the coldness of this prison cell, hearing the screams of wild beasts who wanted to consume his body meat. He learned to survive in the wilderness. He was given the burden of a man that turned this boy into a man, but he has never been the same after that. I still carry the weight of everything I experienced back in those days on my back today, but I'm never going back again. They stole my childhood. That's why you might find me overly joyous sometimes, because I grew up too quick. So I will always be trying to become the boy I never was. I was made a Spartan, like one of those kids from Greece, like being forced to fight to survive, with the trauma of being at war for too long would break your mind. But writing healed mine. I put those painful memories onto a page, unloaded the weight, let it fall out from the tip of my pen, and told myself that everything is going to be okay. I speak and hope they'll see that these poems aren't supposed to entertain. This isn't a stage. It is the Colosseum, and I am standing defiantly as a warrior, but a writer too, who realized that the pen is mightier than a sword. So I decided to use my pen as a sword and fight for my life, because we are more alive when we write. I realized that when I was physically confined. I realized that our tongues were cut when our wrists were cuffed. So tell me, what are we if the difference between the dead and the living is the ability to speak? They see what I see, but they don't see it how I see it. This place that they call prison is a cemetery to me, where voices are buried beneath the ground. I was just another number in their body count, but I will not allow these syllables to be strangled. They will not suppress my speech. Yes, they have cut my tongue, but with this pen, I can still speak without speaking. In this pen, I have found what the rest of these men have been seeking. It is the reason why I am seeing too many men tie a noose to their neck after questioning life's meaning and failing to find a reason why they shouldn't stop breathing. There is no Shakespeare here, but this art is the only hope I have left. It is a matter of life and death, because this system is a savage that will kill you and consume your arteries, but I will use my artistry to fight to preserve life like artists be. It is a revival of me. Writing is me lifting my face from beneath the rubble to prove that I am alive. I was the voice that you couldn't hear. That one day I will be free. The world will know my name. These sirens will not silence me. Every word is a caged revolution waiting to be released. Every word is a caged revolution waiting to be released. Thank you.
Jhanzab told us what inspired the poem.
My journey of writing started in prison, and one of the main reasons why I started writing was because I just felt like so much had happened when I went to prison. And I was really young, and I just felt like all of it happened at such a fast pace, and I didn't actually get to like process everything that I went through. And I guess writing was a healthy way for me to be able to do that. So it kind of became my healing process and a way of reflecting on everything that happened to me before coming into prison. So that poem was just basically a reflection of me, how I felt when I was arrested, and just my thoughts while being in prison and going through the system.
Thank you to everyone who joined us for the first Digital Change Network event and for watching these highlights. As we pull through the current crisis, the role of changemakers across civil society is vital. We at the Sheila McKechnie Foundation are here to unleash the capacity of civil society to drive social change.